Hello, and welcome to episode 115 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
How you doing, buddy? It's been a minute.
It has been a little bit. I'm doing great, actually. No complaints. Weather's beautiful. Happy days.
I love it. That's a good way to start test week, which is where we are at the moment.
Yes, that is coming up later. There'll be a podcast on that, obviously, where we do the traditional recap. I actually have been busy on the podcast front because I was just doing a podcast with Spivey Consulting, and that's a two-part that's coming out.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. That's going to be all about the admissions cycle, presumably.
Yeah, we answered a bunch of questions that were submitted, and there were a lot of great questions, and so there were so many. We broke it into two parts, but I think there's a lot of, really valuable information in there. So I've been working, John. I'm not sure what you've been up to, though.
I've been working a little bit while you're having fun with Mike Spivey. I've been dealing with a lot of students. As you would guess, anxiety is running pretty high the week of the August test, but so far so good. I haven't seen anything too worrisome.
That's good news. Let's hope that test goes well. Obviously, we'll have a lot more about that in our next episode. But before we get to the discussion tonight, which is about reviewing a Logic Games section, tell me what you are drinking.
Yeah, the other key to starting test week is a cocktail. I took a break this past weekend and actually watched this Ken Burns documentary on Ernest Hemingway, which I highly recommend. You have to pay for it, but it's worth the money. But it really got me in a rum mood. Ernest was a fan of the rum down in Havana. But unlike Ernest, I'm not a big daiquiri guy, and I don't love mojitos. So I've just made a good old-fashioned dark and stormy. So some rum, some ginger beer. And it's refreshing. It's delicious.
That is a good drink.
What about you?
And, well, you suggested rum when you were talking about this earlier, so I was immediately struck by the fact that a mojito sounded good. And as usual, I don't make my own drinks because I have no skills there. But the wife has mixed up a coconut mint mojito using coconut rum and some other coconut stuff in there, and it's pretty tasty. So I'm very happy.
It sounds tropical. If you ever find yourself in Havana, you can find about the best mojito on the planet.
You found yourself in Havana.
I did.
I suspect that I shall not find myself in Havana at any point.
Yeah, fortunately, no one else found me in Havana. I could have been in trouble.
Like the authorities.
Exactly. Yeah.
But that's a pretty good check mark on the old, well, it's not on your passport if I recall correctly, but it's a good box to have checked.
Yeah, it was a good experience. I'm glad there's no documentation. You picked the song. Let's move right past that before I incriminate myself.
We'll let that go. State Department's now listening along with the NSA.
There you go.
But the song was it's from one of my favorite bands and certainly one of yours as well. The band is Muse. They've got a new album coming out. It's either later this month or next month. And so they're slowly releasing tracks. And the first couple times I heard the early tracks, I was like, I don't know if I love this. And the more I listened to it, now I really like it. And this is their newest song. And I think from a Logic Games perspective, I really like it. It lines up. The song is Kill or Be Killed. If you want to hear insane guitar playing, go in about like 2-3 minutes and listen to Bellamy go crazy with the fretboard tapping. Guys, it's unbelievable. I'm awestruck by his ability to play.
He's another species, man.
But he's killed this song, and we'll kind of come back to that theme about kill or be killed when we start talking about Logic Games. Let's move right along. Let's go to the LSAT World. John, what's up there?
Yeah, well, I appreciate you throwing this one to me because I get to break the big news of the day, which is that Score Preview, something that's been around since the early days of the Flex test last year, 2 years ago, they've changed the policy on it. It used to be that this was something available only to first-time test takers, where for $45 before the test, $75 in the days right after it, first-time test takers had the opportunity to see their score upon score release with everyone else, and then 6 days to cancel it if they wanted to. The cancellation would still go on your record. It would still count as a regular test attempt, one of your 3 for the year, but you could see your results and know exactly what you were canceling if you chose to. Normally, people could cancel a score in the 6 days after the test, but it was a blind cancel. They wouldn't know what they had gotten. So this conveyed certain advantages in certain situations for first-timers. Only the update here is that LSAC has now opened Score Preview up to everyone. If it's your first time or your 5th, you can now purchase Score Preview the same price, $45 pre, $75 post, and see your score before choosing to wipe it off your record. So that was kind of a cool update. It caught me by surprise. I think I was on Reddit late one night and someone posted a question like, is this real? And sure enough, I investigated and it was.
Yeah, under cover of the night, a huge policy change.
Yep.
No announcement, really. No big kind of fanfare about it. I found that interesting.
Yeah, not a word, not a mass email, not even a little header on their site. It's just they changed the text on this one particular page. But it is legit, and we have multiple confirmations.
It is legitimate. And, again, not to mix podcasts, but on the Spivey podcast, we talked about this briefly, and I'm going to recap that here just for the broader audience. It's a little more LSAT-centric. I think this is a really interesting policy change, in part because, we've been dealing with a score bubble. Mm-hmm. And although that score bubble came down very slightly this past year, it didn't come down a lot. We're still out of alignment with would be the pre-pandemic, pre-LSAT flex normalized distribution curves. And if it's not coming down all that fast, interestingly enough, it's going to be really difficult to know what the situation is comparatively going forward, because now having score preview means that a lot of people will likely choose to cancel scores they don't think meet their standards or that they won't use to apply to law school. And that will distort the curve further. So going forward, when people are like, well, has the score bubble disappeared? It's going to be harder and harder for anyone to accurately predict that. And LSAC will now be in a position of saying, these scores are now on the new, you can cancel whenever you want and have seen it. So they're not comparable. It sweeps an issue under the rug that was certainly a pernicious thorn in their side and eliminates it. And I'm not saying they did it for that reason. I'm not saying they didn't. I'm just saying that, boy, it solves a problem that was certainly growing here. And now we really have almost like a new curve to deal with that we don't get a chance to see beforehand. Obviously, we'll have to see how it plays out over time. But I do think this is going to change the number of lower scores that you see. I mean, how could it not? And that means the distribution is going to look different in this year and future years than it ever has before. It's going to move up and change significantly. So pretty interesting.
Yeah, I have a question for you on that because I have two comments, a comment and a question. My first interpretation of this was less to do with them trying to obscure scoring bubble obviousness and more to do with just a money grab, because keeping this restricted to first timers meant they couldn't take 45 from everybody or 75 from everybody, and now they can. And there are certain advantages to this. Look, there are scenarios where having score preview could be great. If you're not sure if your score has dropped, perhaps, being able to see it and keep a lower score off record on your second or third attempt, I can see the upside of that. Even though schools take highest scores, why show them anything that quantifies decline?
And why not do that if it is going to lower kind of like the concern and consternation that you have if you have gotten a lower score. Mm-hmm. Someone goes 165, then 161. I know from watching students and talking to them that really freaks them out. This eliminates that.
Yeah.
And just for the record, I'm not saying they did this simply to eliminate the score bubble issue and hide it. I don't think that's the case. I just think it happens to be a side effect that they're not unhappy about at all. Really, this brings them in line with some other tests that allow this already. So there's kind of like really going towards what could be considered best practices in this field or a more standard type of thing. It increases the money that they will take in because more people will avail themselves of this. And then it also solves the scoring bubble problem, or at least the appearance of the scoring bubble, by changing the way in which, things can be compared. That sounds like a lot of wins for LSAC here. So this isn't a criticism of them doing this. I'm happy they're doing it.
Oh, yeah, I'm
just
glad they're
saying,
doing it too.
I find it funny that the timing of it is like, oh, suddenly we're doing it.
Yeah, regardless of motivation, I think the outcome is great. I do have a question, though. The money was my comment. Here's my question, which is scores that actually go into someone's file, even if they're the only ones to see it and then they end up canceling it, would those not still contribute to the overall bell curve distribution? Or does a canceled score, even if canceled after processing, still get removed from the final tally?
Well, I think if you're LSAC, you'll track everything and you'll have that in your back pocket so you can watch the test and compare it. But I don't think that the new percentiles are going to be based upon scores that have been canceled. For whatever reason, they were canceled. And we can say that in some cases because people didn't like their scores, but in other cases, there's technical issues and so forth. So that will change the distribution. it'll lower the number of overall scores that are being reported, and then that distribution will change to vary around that. And that's the point when LSAC can say, oh, these two things don't compare. This is the old way where you couldn't have cancellations with seeing it. This is the new way. And who knows? They might actually make the argument. In fact, they probably will. That look, it won't change a whole lot. People who didn't do well already had the option to cancel. They just canceled anyway. But there's a real difference between feelings and actual black and white scores that you can see. And anyone who wants to argue that with me, please come at me.
So the argument now would be it's not so much a scoring bubble that we're seeing, it's a tolerance bubble. What people are willing to essentially display.
Yeah. Now, irrespective of all that, if we're going to just talk about the scoring bubble for a second.
I can tell you're in the mood from the podcast with Spivey this morning.
Yeah, I'm in an aggressive mood today. If we're just going to talk about the scoring bubble, and one of the questions that had been asked recently by multiple people as well, is it going away? Well, it's relative to how you see it. Was it decreasing? Yes, it was decreasing. It was decreasing at a really low rate, though. In fact, you still had a scoring bubble. It was still extant. That hadn't changed. But it had come down just slightly. In fact, less. It came down less last year than I expected it to. I thought that there would be a greater reversion to the norm than there actually was. And that's a long-term problem. If you are a standardized test, you are built on standards, and there's a sudden change in the standard, you're not very standardized anymore. So this kind of, is one way to kind of effectuate change on that. But irrespective of everything else, there still would have been a scoring bubble, and it would have persisted into this year in all likelihood unless they did a radical change. This is a change of sorts. Who knows what happens to the actual test? That's their job, their standards. I think they would argue strenuously they will not mess with the integrity of the test. There's evidence to support that viewpoint because even when there was a score bubble, there weren't radical changes inside that. So I give them credit for that.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I think a lot of times people lose sight of the fact that we're not discussing these things in isolation. They all require some point of comparison. The competitiveness of a cycle, for instance, is really only a meaningful discussion if you can relate it to something more or less competitive in the past. Or expectations about competition in the future. So these things all require some kind of like baseline to measure from. So yeah, I take your point. It'll be interesting to see if this just completely bifurcates things and becomes a separate discussion altogether. Regardless of all that, I think we'll probably do a mailbag issue here in the next couple of weeks once we get this August test behind us. And I know I've got a lot of questions already about this particular issue. Maybe we can get more expansive then.
Yeah, and I can keep on throwing out conspiracy theories as to why this happened.
I love it.
With no notice. That's the part that really gets me. You're making a big change, but you just don't even advertise it. That just strikes me as inherently interesting. I'll choose my words carefully.
I'm having flashbacks to them doing that weird experimental logic game section in June with no advance warning, no notice. It's like, guys, sometimes,
I understood
sometimes
it there.
I do too. Sometimes communication actually works in your favor.
Yeah, I understand that because they could say that's a testing thing and that actually is the best way to test something like that with no notice. This is a policy change. Yeah. A policy change that is fairly significant. When they went to allow score preview for first timers, they announced it. So,
yeah, they were super proud of it. It was like a banner they hung.
Yeah, so why not do it this time? The inconsistency of this, and it makes it look like an outlier to me, and I don't like outliers because I'm a person who, looks at standardized tests and I know what those mean. So as soon as I see something like that, my immediate question is why? That's where I go into a dark place with this, but we'll let it go. We're going to have a competitive cycle. It's still. I'm not sure it's going to be hugely better. It looks like we may see, applicants down a little bit, but if this score bubble is going to persist and now maybe be exacerbated by the fact that people can, cancel low scores that they didn't expect, it's going to keep it for I'm not going to say a rough cycle, but one that is not markedly easier than the prior cycle. But that still is yet to be determined with some of these factors, so we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. What we can speak, I think, more definitively on, at least at this point, are some upcoming tests. So let me just run through a few of the details about August and September. close off the LSAT world here quickly. The August test, as we've alluded to, starts this coming Friday, which is August 12th. It's going to run Friday and Saturday as the two main days, and then next Tuesday, which is the 16th, for accommodated tests, largely paper and pencil. I will make a note here on time slots. In other words, actually registering for your day and time to take the test. You get to choose your own day and time, but you're also limited to whatever availability is still there when you go to choose it. And I've seen a lot of reports of limited availability, sometimes zero availability, when people go to select their day and time, even into the afternoon or the next day after registration opens up. So, word to the wise, a good reminder, sign up as soon as you can. Know when you want to take this test before they open it up, and as soon as they do, go pick your time. I've seen a lot of people reporting that the earliest they could get was like 7:40 p.m. local, which is my dream time slot. Probably yours too. But not ideal for the majority of people out there. And yet that was the only thing remaining. They've opened a few more slots up, which were quickly gobbled. So keep an eye on it. But again, know that these tests that run over 2 days with 20,000 people, it gets crowded and these things do fill up. It's not unlimited availability.
Yeah. If you go back to the early days of the Flex, they were running 3 or 4 test dates. You'd have a couple thousand people on a test day as they worked things out. And, getting to the idea of 10,000 when they started on a single day, that didn't exist. They wouldn't do that because that would strain the system. As time's gone on, they've allowed each individual test day to have more and more test takers. And I know you and I were slightly surprised when some of these tests only had 2 days because we're like, you guys are running 10,000 a day. And I talked to them about this and they were like, we're comfortable with it. And so that's when you have that many people taking it, that's when you get this time slot competition. So this isn't going away. As long as we have this limited number of days and a lot of people on each day, that's where you're going to get this problem. So just be aware of that. Sign up early.
Yeah, foreshadowing September right there, which we'll get to. Speaking of the numbers, 10,000 a day, a week ago today, there were 21,409 people registered for August. As of today, we checked, and it's dropped almost 1,000. There are 20,494 as of me saying it right now.
Which, for better or worse, aligns with what I'd said before. I was like, I think this test is going to be sub 20,000 by the time we get to it. That is going to be over 20% off of last August. And we're definitely in that direction. We got another, we got the actual week of the test and the test itself, and you only need to lose 500 people and melt away. That's going to happen.
Yeah, I think this is probably going to be in the 18,000 kind of range, maybe a little over.
There's a good chance of it.
Those of you who are taking the test coming up, if you don't cancel in the immediate 6 days, whether that's score preview or you just feel like keeping, you'll get your scores back on Wednesday, August 31st. So I'm closing out the month with an LSAT score.
Yep, and that's when your score preview clock will start running, actually.
6 calendar days from then. Yeah.
So then last year, we didn't have a September LSAT. And one of the reasons it's hard to predict how this cycle is looking in terms of test takers is because you have this whole new test at a really prime time. September is a very prime time for people to be taking the LSAT. And so you have that test coming up on Friday and Saturday, September 9th and 10th. The score release on that is almost a month after the August one. It's on the 28th of September. And a week ago, that test had 20,021 registrants. So last year was 0 in September. Now you got 20,000 plus. It's dropped a little bit, but only a week it took to drop just a few hundred. It's down to 19,775. That's not abnormal. That melt, which is the common term that you hear used for it, will accelerate as we get closer to the test. As people are like, nah, I'll take October. Nah, I'll take November.
Which, we're going to leave those tests off the list for now. We'll get to them soon enough. 2 things left. The first is some webinars that we have coming up. I always feel like these are valuable to mention. They're free, available to the public, and for the majority I'm about to mention, if you just sign up for it, even if you can't attend, you will get an archived recording that you can watch later. So get signed up for these. The next one is on the 16th. It's just an LSAT 101. So anyone somewhat new to the test or maybe confused about the nature of how it operates, the construction of it, that's a fantastic place to start. Really make sure you've got the facts right. On the 31st of August, same day the scores come out, there's a seminar on basic conditional reasoning. And that'll cover both logic games and logical reasoning. And then 2 weeks after that, on the 13th of September, there is a follow-up, really, an advanced conditional reasoning seminar. I love that one. All of these are done online, and like I said, they're free and will be recorded for people. And then 1 week later, drum roll, trumpets. On the 20th of September, Dave and I are going to do another crystal ball, this time looking forward to the October and November tests, the final 2 exams of this year.
Yes, that one will not be recorded for the public, although it will be recorded for PowerScore students. Regardless, it is free, one night only for everybody who wants to attend. And recently, we've been hitting our stride in terms of the predictions and the problem sets. Everything working together pretty well. We get a lot of amazing comments afterwards about being on target with the predictions. And obviously hoping that continues here for August as well. So that is September 20th. And then, Jon, I will make the next announcement. It is my privilege to announce that you are teaching one of our upcoming live online LSAT courses.
It's happening. Yeah,
it's happening.
First class I've taught since pre-pandemic, I think.
It's been a minute, as they would say, for you. That class, if you want to be taught by the kind of like insurmountable Jon Denning, that would be August 24th that class starts.
Yeah, I picked that one in part for my own sake, but also because it's one of my favorite schedules for students. It runs Wednesday nights, so just one lesson, one class a week. It really lets people not just like marinate in the ideas, but it gives tons of time to practice between, ask questions, attend the weekly clinics on Friday afternoons where they'll get more instruction. So the way that class is laid out was particularly suitable both for me and anyone who's able to attend. I'm excited, man. I got to tell you, I've already got butterflies a little bit. I'm really pumped.
Getting back in the groove of it. And I was trying to come up with a good adjective there, like estimable.
Oh, thanks.
I don't know if I, really achieved the goal I had, but
is it because you just had too many to choose from?
I had too many to choose from, for sure. I was like, what's the best one here? And I'm not thinking all that fast.
Trust me, I get it. It's hard to narrow down.
It certainly is, but I can speak from experience that Jon is one of the best LSAT instructors in the world. So if you want to be in his class, I would recommend signing up soon for that. There will be a point where that class closes, if it may already be close to that. So
yeah, it'll be fun. Come join me. We'll have a good time. I'm going to throw some extras to the people who are able to attend as well. Whether that's extra sessions, we run early or long a few times, where we get to do some more stuff than normal. Part of the beauty of being me doing this is I really get to do what I want.
Maybe I'll show up to one of your classes and, do a little assist or talk about some various things of interest to me. You never know.
You heard it here, folks. Dave's taking half the class.
I did not promise that, nor would I promise that. No. If I had less to do, I would. Even just getting these crystal balls done has always been a challenge. There's not enough hours in the day to get all the work done here.
This is true. But yeah, Wednesday, August 24th. Come join me if you can. It'll be a good time.
Yeah, be awesome. Best LSAT class you can get, without a doubt, this year or any year. Let's move ahead and let's get into reviewing the logic games from Prep Test 91, which was, if I recall, the May 2020 LSAT.
One of the May 2020 LSATs.
One of the May 2020 LSATs. Right. And they released this form, 91, with 2 logic game sections. The first section is an experimental section, and then I believe it's section 3 on that test that they released that is the real section. We are talking about section 3. So we're going to review this particular exam and just kind of talk a little bit about, briefly, the history of it, and then we're going to go through the games and really focus on the setup and get into the mentality. And given how long that intro was, Jon, it may be that the discussion of the 4 games is about the same length as the intro.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll move quickly. The other distinguishing factor between the 2 game sets on this release test, 91 plus, is the experimental only had 22 questions. So if you're not sure which is which, just do a question count. This one has 23.
Yeah, and you'll know once we get into the game topics here.
I hope so.
But this was not a game section that was foreign to us. This is one that historically has been around for quite some time, and it's a section that I think is overly fair. So on that kill or be killed scale, the hope is that you killed this one and that it didn't knock you out. But I mean, this was originally the logic games that were used in February of 2009.
Yeah.
So people get talking about like modern era tests and so forth. Here's a game section that they're using that is 14 years old. And it really is older than that because they started the development of it before that. February 2009 was an unreleased test. So they administered it to students. Nobody ever got a copy of the test. That allows them to reuse it. Jon, they then went on and reused this multiple times, including they used it in December 2012 as a Sabbath test. It was a makeup test in December 2013. It showed up in June of 2019. Obviously, this May 2020 flex. They've used it since that point, but prior to the release, they used it in Asia in July of 2020. They used it as retakes in January 2021 and June of 2021, and then they released it.
Yeah.
So this is a test that has a long history. It's been used in a lot of places. You can see that it's a cleanup test. Sabbath exams when they had those before, makeup exams, retakes, international exams floating around. But the main administration, the first real notable one, was way back in February of 2009.
Yeah.
And what would you say about the overall difficulty of this section, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, you suggested it before, and I completely agree that it's a fair section. I think it really checks all the boxes of competency when you go through this. This will quickly reveal to you if you have some profound deficiency, because you see really everything that you would expect to see. You've got basic and advanced linear, you've got grouping, you've got combinations, there's numerical distributions, there's an opportunity at least once for templates, which we'll certainly discuss. So, I mean, this to me is a really robust set of games to test every single aspect, every feature of your skill set. And at the same time remains, I think, remarkably fair across the board. There's some high and low points of difficulty, to be sure. But on the whole, I'd say this is reasonably straightforward, but a very good bellwether of sorts. If you can do well here, I think it bodes great for what you're likely to see. I'll make one more comment so that this isn't just all speculative. We can look at the curve on this test and actually draw some insights from that as well. The overall curve for a 170 on this test, which is usually the benchmark we use, was a -7. Pretty tight in the grand scheme of things, which means, again, that these games didn't present anything that was overly difficult.
Yeah, this wasn't expanding the scale and loosening it, so this wasn't high difficulty. I think one other point that's useful about this section, it's another good test of section management. There is an expectation, I think when I look at this, and I think you look at it as well from a professional standpoint, that one of these games is going to require more time than the others. And you better manage the section so that you gain a little time on the other 3 games where it is in fact possible to gain time. And then that allows you to expend that extra time on the difficult game, which in this case is the 3rd one.
Yeah, we're going to elaborate on that. But if there's a be killed moment, it's definitely game 3.
100%. So let's just kind of go through this. But section management is always something that we're thinking about. It's not necessarily the difficulty. If you do things and you don't adapt to the changing circumstances, that can knock you out just as much as a hard game. So let's take a look at that very first game, which we've called the Salespeople Territories. I personally love this game. As soon as I saw it and I started working through it, I was like, I felt it was relaxing to me as a logic game could be. It was a great start to this section. And what you have is you've got 5 salespeople being assigned to 3 territories that are lettered out. And they tell you right in the scenario that there has to be, everyone is assigned to exactly one of the territories. So we don't have people going to multiple territories. That means you've got a 5 into 3 scenario right out of the gate. And that is pretty nice. And then there's additional rules that they kind of will play around with the number scenario. But if you see 5 into 3, and as we will find out, as we'll see, every territory ends up with somebody, you know that you have 2 distributions right away. You either have a 2-2-1 in some order or a 3-1-1 in some order. So you have to immediately see those numbers. If that didn't jump out at you right out of the gate, you need to rethink how you're doing logic games, because that needs to be the first thing that you see. Both Jon and I immediately locked in on that. When we were making notes about this, that's the first thing we both have. Is there's a numerical distribution. Looks like there's 2 of them here. That's from the scenario. Things do change thereafter. You want to talk about the rules a little?
I do. Before I do that, I want to expand on one point, which is in the grand roulette wheel of grouping scenarios. 5 into 3 is probably where I'd put my money if I had to guess it, a single one to reappear. I think that might be the most common situation to happen in grouping games like this, where you're assigning more to less. 5 into 3 is a favorite. And if you don't believe me now, wait a couple games. This isn't the last time you'll see it, even in this section.
Well, I mean, what you often see is 5, 6, or 7 into 3. Those are 3 of the most common distributions. And then a lot of times it's that they jump it out to 5 or 6, where you've got like, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, but definitely 3 groups and any of the variations. If you don't know what the distributions are automatically with a minimum of 1 in each section, you need to just play around with it more. I'm not saying you have to memorize it, but we've both done it so many times that we do have them memorized. It's like instantaneous. And again, you might think, well, I don't need to have that. I'm like, how good do you want to be at this? If we can do it instantaneously, that means we're already moving faster than the person next to us.
Sure.
And although it's not a direct head-to-head competition, we are all being measured by the standard of expectation that the test makers say, this is what we think the average test taker will do, the 160 test taker, the 170 test taker. Obviously, the faster you go, the better it is for you as long as you maintain accuracy.
Yeah. I haven't done the proper accounting to tally them up. My point is simply this. I think 5 into 3, of all of the different arrangements, 5 into 3 is probably the most historically common. I could be wrong about that. You may disagree, but that's where my money is.
I don't know that I've ever thought about it from a count standpoint, but now you've made me think about it from a count standpoint.
I didn't think about it till the second time I saw it in this section. I was like, God, they do love this, don't they?
Here's the thing where it gets difficult to actually assess that question. There are so many different ones that exist that it's easy to think, no, it isn't the most common. But when you start thinking about various games that have this structure, there are quite a bit of them. So I'm not going to argue this point.
Oh, where's the fun in that? All right.
I know. Sorry. You want to hit the rules?
Yeah, let's get through them. We just talked about the 2 possible distributions, but they don't both live long. The first rule, each territory has no more than 2 people assigned to it. That whittles it down to a single distribution. We're in the 2-2-1 distribution across these 3 FGH territories.
Which is super helpful. So you're not even dealing with 2 different scenarios. You're just dealing with a single scenario. And it's nice to get that as the first rule because you can establish that whatever the order is for the territories, that one of them will have a single salesperson and the other 2 will each have 2. We know that to be the case.
And nothing is more important with numbers like that than tracking the actual assignment of people into the numbered groups themselves. You know you've got 2 doubles and a single. If you can figure out the single, if you can figure out a double, it is a huge, huge piece of insight into any game, this one included.
So then the second rule comes up and basically tells you that M and P, two of the salespeople, can't go together. It's nice. I like rules like that. I want to have separation. It's not game-changing by itself at this point. I'm like, oh, okay. It's just, to me, I just created a vertical not block with M and P and said they're out.
Exactly what I did. Nothing happens in your actual base in the diagram itself. This is just a rule off to the side. But at least you know that M and P can't be one of these double groups. That's what this tells me.
Yeah, and I've got F, G, and H as my base. I know you do too as well.
Yes.
I've got a space for each one of them. I'll figure out where the 2s and the 1s actually are later on. But right now, M and P is just off to the side.
Yep.
Next rule.
Third rule. It controls L, essentially, and tells us 2 things about L. L is either with M, so that would be a double group, and of course, M and P are separate. It wouldn't matter here with a group of 2. L is either with M, or L is the single solo person. This is the one in this distribution. Yeah, this is a really powerful rule.
I think it's easy to think to yourself, oh, it's just L. But we already know M and P don't like each other, and now we have this limitation with L, and they do what I think is a huge service to test takers. They tell you that when L is in a double, it's with Marcia, and so it's kind of like fantastic. So now I can actually see what L's outcome possibilities are, regardless of what happens in this game. That's really limiting. L is determined. The only thing that's not determined is where L is going, but even that's going to be limited.
Yeah, you can start to feel how this rule would trigger things and how this rule would get triggered. If you could see another double, you know L's a single. If M is with O, you know L is a single. So there's so many ways this could happen. If P is a single, then you know L has to be. Can P be a single? No. There are so many ways that this rule could come into play, though, and we see in each of those cases where it does how controlling it is. So really pay attention to the groups. At this point, you know that an OP double, for instance, is impossible. O and P can't go together here either.
Yeah, and let's come back to that here, because that is a very powerful point in this particular.
Sorry, not OP, ON. I misspoke.
N and O, yeah.
Apologies. Too many variables.
P could be with either O or M, but we'll come back to that in a minute. And at this point, I was like, there's something going on with the 2-2-1 and the possibilities. I may look at that in a moment, but let's just check that last rule.
Mm-hmm.
And then it says that P is part of a double.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it's got to be at H with somebody else. I'm like, so P is part of the double. We already know it's assigned to H. That's further limiting. And at that point, I was like, I'm going to show these two basic templates. And the templates are built around what happens with L.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter which one is your first template or which one is your second template. In fact, I'm going to start with the one where L is solo.
Okay.
So we know we have a 2-2-1. The 1 is now L. L is in its own little box by itself. What do you know about M and P? They can't go together. So P is in 1 with somebody. Now M can't be there. M's got to be in the other double set. So now we've got L, M, and P separated into different territories. We know that M and P are both in double territories. The only two variables that are left are O and N.
Yeah. And the P is an H, by the way. So P is
and we'll add that. At the end, we'll add that. O and N are rotating around. So P is assigned to H. That single L and then M along with N or O, whichever one it is with, is now rotating back and forth between F and G. That's super limiting.
Mm-hmm.
I loved it. And then, of course, if you flip it around and you put M and L together, so now L is with M, what do you have? You've got the other double is P, and the only two variables that are now remaining are N and O, so one of them is with P. So, and of course, it's at H.
Mm-hmm.
You've just learned that P is always with N or O, so you know that. And then the single in that scenario is either N or O. And again, that ML double or that single NO option is either F or G. That's your whole game. Basically 8 solutions total based on those two templates. You should be off to the races at the highest rate of speed possible.
Yeah, this is a chance to really bank some time. I'll just again reiterate one point you made there, and it was clear to me, but I want to make sure it's clear to everyone else too. In these templates, the only group, really the only person you can fix to a territory is P and H. It's going to go with N or O each time. We know it has to be a double, but we don't know where L, M, and the other of N and O are going to go necessarily. We just know how it is, the composition that they take part in. L's a single with M and N or M and O, or L's a double with M and then NO is the single. We don't know whether they go in F or G, though. So there is some mystery about placement, but very little mystery about the groups themselves in these two templates.
Exactly. And then the questions aren't bad. You start off with a classic list question. Thank you. That's exactly how I want to start every game section. The next couple of questions, 2 and 3, you have to do a little bit of work with inside each template, but it shouldn't be too bad. It's just a matter of like watching what happens with each. And then you've got like a cannot be true question that's pretty easy with the templates. And then you're out of there with one final question where you can, again, use the templates to figure it out. And it's like, that is fantastic.
Yeah.
It should be fast.
People who've listened to us long enough will not be surprised to hear I did not do templates for this game. I saw them. I didn't feel I needed them. I could see the movement here. So when we talk about templates, we're really talking about them as an opportunity that could be hugely beneficial for the right people.
Yeah, John, but you're also like been doing this for 20 years and you're in the top of your game with this. So my argument would be, I like to do it according to my standard of what I think the right way to do it is. So of course I use templates because I think that is the right way to do it here.
Real subtle, that.
And I think that actually benefits the greatest number of people because you get such a massive amount of control over the game when you do that. I loved it. As soon as I made those two and they're numerically based, they're just really 2-1-2, breakdowns there. I didn't worry so much about F, G, and H aside from knowing that P was with H. Once I had that, I was like, there's nothing they can do here that's going to really stop me. Now it's a matter of feeling comfortable, confident, and moving quickly without making an error.
Yeah.
And that was successful.
I'll put some value to the templates, even though I didn't use them, which is for people trying to figure this out, people trying to understand the nature of templates and really how numbers control the game in general. These two templates aren't based on where the people go. They're based on how the people go together or separate into the 2-2-1. These are number-driven templates, not placement-driven templates. And that to me is an extremely important idea to differentiate, I think. A lot of people look at templates and like, well, I don't know what I could fill in exactly. It's like sometimes just knowing the composition and how they move around is hugely, hugely helpful.
Focus on the 2-2-1, not the FGH.
Yeah.
You can connect H in at the end, but it's not something that should really be the focus. And that decision is all contextual. It's because of the fact that the distribution is controlling this, not the FGH. In another game, it might be the FGH, and that's what we'd be worried about.
Sure.
So it will change. There's no hard and fast rule with that. You have to actually react to what is being presented to you. Let's go to game number 2.
Yeah, hopefully at this point, anyone moving to game number 2 is feeling great, maybe a little wary about what might lie ahead after that softball. But you ought to at least have, only a handful of minutes ticked off the clock through game 1 if you approach it correctly.
The classic example is you have 8 minutes and 45 seconds to do a game. That is an average. It is not, that's what you should use. In this particular instance, you want and need to do it faster than this. How fast? It depends upon you and your comfort zone. If this discussion of templates is confusing to you and you're like, what are they talking about? Go do it. Go chart it out. Go take a look at it until it is second nature to you. This is a game where you have to make time up. You have to go faster than 8:45, hopefully by more than a minute or even 2 minutes. It is possible. Then we get to the second game, which I think is a higher level of difficulty than the first game, but it's not the end of the world. It's just harder, not super hard.
Yeah, I agree with you. This is the one about festival concerts. So we start, interestingly enough, with a game dealing solely with groups. And then we move to something a little more, I think for most people, palatable, which is basic linear, a balanced basic linear game with this scenario. It's a pianist performing in 3 concert formats over 6 days, where each of the 3 formats, orchestra, jazz, and solo, gets performed at least once. So you can see again, if distributions turns into the theme today, I won't be upset. It's certainly thematic in this as well. There's 3 ways that you could start to spread 3 things out into 6, where each get used at least once.
Yeah, so whereas you start off with 5 into 3, one of the other common ones that I mentioned is 6 into 3. And that's exactly what we have. And when you have a 6 into 3 with a minimum of 1 in each of the 3 groups, which is orchestra, jazz, and solo, you really get 3 basic distributions. Again, unfixed, floating around: a 4-1-1, a 3-2-1, and a 2-2-2. So coming into this, those are immediately the 3 distributions. I know both John and I wrote them down instantly, saying this is what is possible. There is more to say about those distributions, especially as it relates to the variables. So we'll just hold off on that until we get a little more information about the game. But all of us who are doing this and are good at it are saying, all right, now I know what the number setup is. Maybe they'll eliminate some of those. Maybe they'll modify it somewhat, but I don't know yet. I need to see the rules.
Yeah, 1 through 6 for the base. These 3 things getting repeated at least once each. We'll talk more about the numbers in a bit, but that's the initial scenario, and we get to the rules. And I'll take the first rule and you jump in at any point. The first rule here is conditional, which I think a lot of people maybe either fail to spot or misunderstand. It says this, that anytime you have O, which was orchestra here, it must be followed immediately by J, which is jazz trio. This is not a regular block. O and J aren't always in this configuration. O triggers this rule. When you see an O, J will follow it. But J does nothing with this rule. If I saw a J in the 4th spot, I wouldn't know that O had to go 3rd, for instance. If I saw O 3rd, I'd know J was 4th. So be careful. This doesn't go both directions. O controls it, J does not.
So look, if you're struggling with logic games, this is a good rule to look at and say, why does it work this way? Because a lot of people look at this and say it's an OJ block. It is not an OJ block. Part of the way you know that is the very first word is whenever. That is a sufficient condition indicator. Whenever N performs in the festival with the orchestra, so whenever we have O, then she performs in the festival the following day with J. So whenever O appears, then it must be OJ. But that's the trigger, is the O part. It's not J having anything to do with this. If it was a block, it would say, they're always performed together in that fashion. That's not what this says.
Yeah. N, by the way, is not a variable in this game for anyone who's scratching their head. I just did a double take when you said that. N is Noguchi, who's the pianist in this game. She's playing, but the pieces are the variables, OJS.
An excellent point.
Yeah. This, to me, I had two takeaways from this. One was just a simple not law in 6. If O has to be followed by J, then O can't go last.
Yeah.
You do not get the symmetry with J not law in 1 because, again, J can still do anything. J's free. O just needs it. The other thing that this told me was that there had to be at least as many J's as O's. So numerically speaking, and numbers are the key to this, you cannot have more O's than J's. Every O has a J, and then there might be more J, too.
Yeah, and that is kind of the key thing. Every time you have an O, there's going to be a J behind it. So you couldn't have a situation where there were, say, 4 O's and just a single J. That would violate that. So this is where we start to get some information about those possible distributions. Like in that 4-1-1, you know that when we take a look at this, O is not going to be the 4. There's not going to be 4 O's there. It's got to be one of the singles that's there. And so that's the kind of thing that you can start to connect back to the distribution. And this is classic logic games. You learn something, then you learn a little bit more. Another layer is added. Then you learn a little bit more. You start to see more nuance with it. But I think this is an interesting rule. The people who got themselves into trouble in this game often misdiagrammed this rule, got some of the questions right because it won't kill you on every question, but then they missed a few questions because it's not tied where O and J have to block out like this. Only when O is present is that block active.
Yeah, notice what we're doing here, and I think this is a good lesson, especially for people, maybe as they reach the higher levels of scoring or proficiency, is we're actually looking at these rules not just for what they mean and how we do it, we're also seeing the potential dangers they create for the less initiated.
100%.
Yeah.
That's what I consider our job to be. Explain what's happening, also explain where they're trying to trap you.
Yeah, but if you can start to spot the traps, even if they aren't necessarily something you'd fall into, you begin to really understand this test at a deeper level. It starts to make a lot more sense just looking at the ways the test makers are trying to hurt people who might not be you.
Yeah, so then we roll to the second rule, which is a little bit more open. And this is basically saying that the performances on the first and third days are of identical type. They're the same concert format. And that is something that you probably are going to want to diagram internally, where you connect the first and the third. It can be underneath, it could be over the top, it doesn't matter, but you really do want to show physically on the diagram that you're making on your scratch paper that 1 and 3 are connected. They will be identical. So if you figure out what the first day format is, you automatically know the third, and the same is true in reverse. If you figure out the third day format, you automatically know what the first day format is. And right now, there's no limitation. If you think, wait, that OJ kind of situation, nope. It could be any of the 3. You could have OJ, OJ, you could have JOJ, you could even have S in those 2. So all 3 of the formats are available the way this rule is presented.
Yeah, and remain so even through the third and final rule, which we come to now, I think, which is a pretty simple not block. You can never have O the day immediately after S.
And this is a block, okay, or not block in this case. Right. If you're like, wait, I'm struggling with this concept, compare the first and the third rules, and you'll notice the first rule is much longer because it has a whole sufficient condition. The third one is really absolute. It never performs this way. You will never have S followed by O. Those 2 things won't happen. And that is a pretty powerful piece of information. So what does that mean in terms of how that affects O, Jon?
Yeah, what's interesting is we already knew that O was trailed by J. So the day after O, every time a J has to go there. But this actually affects something happening the day before O all of a sudden. This rule tells us it can't be S. The first rule tells us you can't have O in a row. Rhymed way more than I meant to.
Yeah, that would be a problem because there'd be no J after that first O.
If you've got an O, J is the next day. You can't have consecutive O, which means anything on the day before an O has to be a J as well. After the first spot, you can have O in the first position. But anywhere following that, anywhere where there's a day ahead of it, you can't put S, you can't put O. There must be a J, both after and before any O that you use. So you start to see really the fundamental necessity of having a lot of J's available.
And it's funny, this isn't really an inference-driven game, but this is one of the few good inferences in this game, where it's like, that's a kind of curious. You see O in the first rule and you see it in the third rule. Connect those two. Think about what the possibilities are and what is actually happening. Even though one of them is talking about before and after, you can actually piece them together to make this further inference about what will happen. And of course, all these rules actually have an impact on the numbers. You know, we mentioned before that, like in the 411, you are not going to have 4 O's that are there. And you can actually figure out the maximum. For example, in the 321, you can't have O be the 3.
Right.
Because again, it would be more O's than J's. That's not possible, which tells you right away that the most number of O's you're ever going to get is 2. And this is how we can start to connect some of these variables back. And that is helpful with that distribution because it gives us some limitations in mind as to what can happen in these games.
Yeah. Question 7, for instance, plays on this idea of maxing out the O's with just 2 and what happens.
So when we get to the end of all these rules, we've done a little bit with the distributions. I can see a few things like O is a single in the 411 and so forth. But how's our setup look, John?
Well, pretty skeletal, frankly. I mean, it is barren landscape when I look down. I've got 6 spots. I've got a not law under 6 for O. I've got a little curvy, rainbow-looking double-headed arrow between 1 and 3, just to remind me they're the same. And that's all she wrote.
Yeah, other than your side notations, the setup is essentially empty. Now, this is what happens, you know, in the past with a lot of people. They'd freak out. I missed something. That you can probably place these variables. No, one of the reasons they liked this section is that it has a very modern aspect to it, and that is that it is very broad and loose. And as I've said in the crystal ball for the last several times, this is a feature of games these days that they are really preying upon, where the setup sometimes just is really open and there's nothing that you can put down. Your response at that point is really important from a section management standpoint. You have to realize this is okay. Don't panic. Don't freak out. Move to the questions and say, let me learn a little bit more about this. A lot of times people think empty setup, I screwed up. That is not the case at all. And this isn't even the only game in this section where we're going to actually see that same thing happen. So this is something that they're actively doing. They know that people react this way. You have to manage what you're doing internally and not overreact to this. It is okay. 2 people who actually do games for a living do really the same setup here, and there's nothing to it. Diagram of the rules, a few small inferences, everything's open. I figure I'm now going to have to go in and probably do a little bit of work. I'll get my list question, which is what I get right out of the gate.
Yeah.
And then after that, I start running into a bunch of questions where I'm like, oh, look, if this happens, you know, and what could be true, and there's some little bit of openings here and there, and I've got to try some scenarios. There's a lot more hypothetically in this game than I would have needed in the first one.
Sure.
And that's the way this type of games work. A bigger setup like that means that you're going to get a different type of experience inside the game. That's okay.
Yeah, it's funny coming off the heels of a game with templates, 2 really powerful templates where you've got so much shown and only 8 solutions. And then you arrive at this, where there's just virtually nothing that you can do up front. We talk about front-loaded and back-loaded games. This one's very back-loaded. Your time is going to be spent in the questions here. The good news is, if you get to the questions quickly, you've got the time to do them. Where I think a lot of people would find themselves kill or be killed would be if they spent 5 minutes in this setup looking for inferences that don't exist. That's the danger.
And I would also point this out is that, you know, one of the things I said was that I went on and I had a bunch of specific work to do. It wasn't because the questions are ordered that way. I went and did those questions first.
Did you start with number 9?
Well, I started with the very first question.
Or the list, but yeah.
The list question with number 6 and said, all right, we'll knock that out. I was happy with that. And then you look at questions 7 and 8, and they are both global questions. You know, one's a could be true and one's a cannot be true. And I thought to myself, I don't know enough about this game. I'm going to just sit here and think through these and have to kind of chart out a few things. So I went right to number 9 and I saw that if, which is kind of hilarious because number 9 helps answer number 8.
Yep.
When you go back to it, eliminates some of the answers there. But my whole thing was let's go to 9 and let's go to 10 and work with the if scenarios and just get a play with the variables and how the rules are working. And once I had that, then I felt okay to go back to questions 7 and 8 and, you know, try to knock off some wrong answers based on the hypotheticals I'd created. that is section management right there. It's like realizing open setup means that I need to do some specific work. Then I don't let them dictate to me a couple of rough questions on 7 and 8 that are really global. I go bypass that, go right to the real work, get it done, get a sense of what the game's going on about, learn more about it. Then I feel better and happier to go back and do those broader global questions.
That's funny. I did the exact same thing. I did the list question, no problem. 7 and 8, I was like, I'll see you soon. Not yet. And then I did 9 and 10 right away. I was like, all right, I got a handle on this. 9 creates these 2 3-piece blocks that can alternate.
Mm-hmm.
And then, 10 just puts a whole bunch of J's. It dumps 4 J's down onto the thing. And you see who's left. Where are you going to put the other 2, the O and the S? Yeah, and at that point, I was like, all right, I got a good grip on this thing. And I went back into the other questions, no problem. But skipping ahead saved me a lot of time, ultimately, because it really revealed a lot about the nature, the mechanics of the game.
Even question 9 is like, 3 S's in a row. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So, they're throwing kind of a unique scenario right at you with that, but it makes you think about it. Now, some people might say, well, you guys do this for a living. Of course you would do that. Think about the logic and the explanation of what we were saying there that led us to this determination. The setup had no info in it. So we were like, maybe I'll take a different track through this. Compare that to the first game where we had so much setup information. I was like, I'm just going to crush every single question.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You respond differently depending upon what they give you. This is kind of like a boxing match. And you're opposing somebody and they may have a stylistic tendency or they're always blocking on the left side or the right side or whatever the case may be. And you have to change your angle of attack based upon their defense. Same exact thing here.
Yeah, every game's a different opponent.
Totally is. And that takes us to game number 3.
Yeah, so 2 games. The second one I would say is harder than the first, largely for the empty setup. But yeah, we're at the halfway point, but you should not be at the halfway point on your clock.
No. That second game is probably going to take a little more time because it's going to require a little more work than that first game. Notice, again, the work very different. Setup work in game 1 is where all the time is spent. In game 2, it's in the questions. Now we get to game 3. Hopefully you have some extra time. You're probably thinking, well, neither of those first 2 games was just utterly terrible, so something bad is coming. This is the something bad that they sent at people. This is the crop rotation game. And what they have is they've got these 5 crops that are being rotated. And they're weird crops, man. Oats and potatoes, I think, are fine. Rye, I get it. Sunflowers, I guess we need sunflower seeds. I do like them. It seems like a weird crop to grow with the first 3 more staples. Well, and then vetch.
The Ukrainians out there would clearly have a word with you.
I suppose so. But the vetch, man, when I encountered that, I was like, what is vetch?
You don't know what vetch is? It's usually for cattle feed. It's a type of pea plant.
It's a really kind of like low quality crop to grow from a nutritional standpoint. When I ran into vetch, I was like, I haven't encountered that one, man. I guess you eat a lot of vetch, so you tell me.
Yeah, I graze. No, I don't think I've ever had vetch, but I was familiar with what it was for God knows what.
You got me on that one, and I pride myself on knowing things, so
I've got vetch, you've got grapes. You win this round, Galoran.
That's true. I know crops, just not vetch, but it's low nutrition. I know crops that turn into alcohol. Yeah. Anyway, so here you have these 5 crops that are being grown in a field, and they're rotating them through, and they're only going to be used once. So that's nice because that tells you that the 5 crops are essentially going to be linear in nature, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then they also tell you that there's a second feature to each crop, whether or not it is irrigated or fertilized, but not both. So it's just a single. And you can think right at that point, hey, this is a advanced linear game. There's going to be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 set of spaces. Then there's going to be a row for the crops, and that is going to be our O, P, R, S, and V of all things. And then another row on top of that is going to be either I or F. Irrigation, fertilize. And so we're going to have these 10 spaces. There's going to be 2 aspects to each one of the 5 placements for the crops.
Yeah. Classic advanced linear, balanced, 2 rows. We see them do this all the time as well. I mean, there's literally dozens and dozens and dozens of games that have a row of variables being ordered and then an either or quality or characteristic to them in a second row above. This is extremely standard stuff.
And I think everybody who's starting this game says to themselves, I can do this. I've seen games like this before. It feels comfortable. There's nothing so far in the game scenario that suggests there's any problem. And I would argue that really the first two rules reinforce that impression. So the first rule is essentially that there's no, double fertilization that's going on. They say that no two crops grown consecutively are both fertilized. So, all right, so I can't have an FF block. So I just put FF, not block. I was happy. This is a standard type of linear rule. Didn't really need to think about it any further. Then they give us the sequence with S, O, and R. Just make sure you get the sequence in the right order because, as usual, they try to make it one long sentence with no commas.
Yeah, they put the middle piece first in this sentence, as they like to do. It's later than that, but earlier than this. It's like, come on.
Yeah, so the whole thing, like the object or the subject rather of the sentence is the oats. So you're talking about the oats are later than S, but earlier than R. So that gives you an S-O-R sequence. Yeah. So at that point, I'm like, this is cool, man. This is the most relaxing game section I've ever done. And I'm feeling to myself that I might take, some time off after the game section, just take a nap.
Yeah,
that's when all hell starts breaking loose.
I knew enough about this, given its many, many uses over the years. In fact, that actually raises a point that I want to mention. Note what they did with this set of games. It came out in 2009. They used it a few times up to 2013, and then it just went dormant until 2019. This got a 6-year break, and then they bring it back 5 times between 2019 and release. If you don't think that this is a perfect indication of what the test makers are up to right now, you're just missing the trend of usage. This is very, very relevant and current. As you
that's
said
an excellent
before.
point.
Yeah.
And whenever I do game sections, I don't go back and look at any of our notes on it. I want to go do it as cold as possible. But notice how they're lulling you into sleep with these standard game formats. John, what happens in rules 3 and 4 that kind of blow this game a little bit apart?
Yeah, well, the point that I was going to make too was before I got to those final couple of rules, and I knew enough about the section that it wasn't really agonizing, but if I had been taking this for the first time for real, my fear at this point is something crazy is going to happen in game 4. This is way too easy so far for game 4 not to be a terror. And then I read the last 2 rules and I was like, okay, maybe I didn't give this game enough credit. Here's the third rule. It's conditional. It says if potatoes are not grown third, then they're fertilized. What that means is that everywhere potatoes go, except for third, you know something about them. They come in this PF, potatoes fertilized, block.
Right, and this is one of those rules that you don't often see in games, but I've said many times, whenever it appears, it destroys everybody. It's got a negative condition for the sufficient side.
Yeah.
So potatoes not third, then what you get is that they are fertilized. That's a tough, that's a weird conditional. And for a lot of people, they don't stop and think about it. They might not even, do the contrapositive or go through the implications. What's the implication of that rule in terms of what's happening?
Sure. Well, the contrapositive, as you mentioned, is that if you do see that potatoes are, was it irrigated, I think? You know they have to be third. What it really means, though, is you've got this PF block 4 out of 5 places. Everywhere but third, you've got a PF block. So
it would appear if P was first, then it was
first
PF.
Or second or fourth or fifth. It has to be a PF block. Only in third is it uncertain. It could still be PF in 3. So it's a really tricky rule to really grasp the implications because it starts with this absence, this not idea. But to me, what triggered this was the idea of all right, I'm really going to have to watch the irrigated and fertilized because they're going to push P around in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Make sure that that's something that, you keep your eye on. And of course, if you do find out that P is irrigated, it can't be first, second, fourth, or fifth. An irrigated potato crop would have to be on the third.
It's the only place that's even allowed. Keep in mind, too, this isn't the first time they've talked about fertilized crops. From the first rule, you can't have FF. So wherever P goes away from third, the crops on either side of it have to be irrigated. That's a big inference here, too. If P is fourth, then 3 and 5 are irrigated because P and 4 has to be fertilized. That's what this third rule says. So we're starting to see at this point now a connection between rules and a connection across vertical space between the 2 rows as well. It's one of their favorite things to do with advanced linear games. It's one of the more challenging aspects of having multiple rows. They won't isolate rules to just a single variable set. They mix, they match, they interweave. And that's what we get here, finally.
All right, so that's annoying.
Well put.
And you right then you're like, okay, so now this is going to get harder. And then you start the fourth rule, and what do you see? You see another if.
Yeah, a more complicated one, frankly.
And I think it's dependent, because what's happening here is you've got a conditional rule, but this one also has a sequence in it. So in this case, if V is grown earlier than R, so that's a sequence of V being earlier than R, then you actually get kind of a vertical block where oats are fertilized. So you get an OF vertical block. That's two things happening in terms of rule types, sequence and block being connected into a conditional statement. All right, so really a third type. And then there's both horizontal aspects, the left to right of the V being earlier than R, and vertical aspects with the oats being fertilized. That's complicated. I don't care how you slice it. Anyone who would say, oh, that's an easy rule, I crushed it. I'm like, sure you did. But did you see all the possible operational effects? No, nobody did. Not at least instantaneously.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, in a reasonable amount of time, I'm not sure there's any realistic expectation someone's going to fully grasp the potential impacts of this.
No,
which is fine, frankly.
And it is okay. There's some things you're just not going to know. A lot of these games and questions just have too many, nuances. You can't get them all, and that's okay. If you need to, you can discover it during the questions. Don't worry about the things that you're like, I don't know this.
Yeah.
You're not going to get everything all the time, and that's okay. I will say the contrapositive of that rule is kind of cool. Mm-hmm. It is a conditional rule. The necessary condition initially was that the oats are fertilized. So if you negate that and reverse it on the contrapositive, if the oats are irrigated, all right, now you negate the original sufficient condition, which was that the vetch was earlier than the rye. In this game, since there's no ties, it reverses. So if the oats are irrigated, then you get a sequence where the rye is earlier than the vetch.
Yeah, I love contrapositives like that of binary things. It's either fertilized or irrigated, so you never deal with a negative, you just flip between the two. There's no ties in this, so V's ahead of R or R's ahead of V. Those are your only options. I much prefer that than a bunch of slashes through stuff.
I do as well, and what I would challenge everyone out there to do is if you look at that rule, how fast can you diagram it and its contrapositive? Because it should be instantaneous. Again, that's the level that we're seeking in terms of like your ability. You should be able to diagram that rule by itself. It's a sequence and a block in a conditional relationship. That should be immediate. And then everything is binary, as Jon just said. So you should be able to do the contrapositive instantaneously as well. Go practice that if it wasn't immediate. And then ask yourself, if you didn't take the contrapositive and you knew it was conditional, why didn't you? Just habitually see that. Either write it down or at least see it mentally so you know what it is. My rule is always this. The more complex the rule, the more likely I am to write down the contrapositive. This is a pretty complicated rule, so I'm writing down the contrapositive.
Yeah, I'm not one to do unnecessary work, but I'll tell you, I wrote the contrapositive here too. I know. Shocking. I wrote something down, Dave. Can you believe it?
I think, Jon, you do logic games, and you're like, I didn't write anything down. I just did it in my head.
That's how I learned.
I'm the guy. On the other side, I'm the guy who writes everything down because we both consider ourselves lazy, and it expresses itself in different ways. You don't write anything down. I write everything down, so I have to stop thinking about it. So,
yeah. You do all the work with your hands. I do all the work between my ears. But it comes really to the same thing. I think if there was a way to quantify effort, it would still be low for both of us. Probably roughly the same.
No further comment. Let's move on.
I just heard it. Sorry.
Didn't think we'd get there in logic games.
Usually those are intentional, but not that.
Not this time. So let's move into kind of like the overview of the setup, because it's really hard to kind of piece these things together. You get some easy not laws from that second rule about S is earlier than O is earlier than R. There's 6 of them, just like there always are. I don't know that it even is required to write them down. I just do out of habit. But Jon, is anything filled in of the 10 spaces that we have?
Not on my diagram, no. No, I've got
Not
some
on mine.
novellas underneath from that SOR thing. I've got the
Hmm.
rules and a single contrapositive. And I've got a lot of eagerness to go collect some points because this is 2 games in a row where I feel like they haven't given me much to work with up front.
They haven't. And of course, for a lot of people, they got to this juncture and what went through their mind was, I'm not sure I understood those last 2 rules, which is understandable. They're both tough. And then there's nothing here. There's no inference. I'm missing something. And this is the point where you say to yourself, do you trust yourself? If you don't, your tendency is to go back and reread everything and re-diagram it or fool around with it a little bit more because you're like, I just don't know if I got everything.
Mm-hmm.
If you do trust yourself, you say, this is a game that's actually designed so that I can't figure this out up front. This is not going to be a setup game. There's many of those out there. This is that modern idea we were talking about in the second game, and you go to the questions.
Go to the questions, yeah.
Especially
Listen, this happens. Never more so than lately. This happens. You get empty setups.
yeah. And in this case, pray that there will be a list question. And there is one. It's a little bit annoying. It's the very first one out there, and you and I both noted that the format of how they did it was irritating because it's vertical, whereas I think most of us do our setups on a horizontal way, but it's still doable. You just have to adjust for that, and you just are essentially marking off on the side, and that gives you an immediate opportunity to work with some of the rules, see them in action, and eliminate answer choices, and ultimately confirm the right answer. But this is, again, going to be a game where you spend more time in the questions doing actual work. And I will say this again, and I said it in the last game, you have to be prepared to do hypotheticals, to draw out little mini skeleton diagrams and just put variables in certain places to see how things work. Because if you don't have any inferences and your setup's wide open, that's what is typically required. Don't be scared of it. Don't hang back. Just dive in there and start doing it. And it actually makes a big difference in this game.
Yeah, I'm going to double down on that actually and give a practical tip to people. People that are maybe intimidated by the skeletal nature of the setups that we've now seen 2 games in a row. Click to the questions very quickly if you're unsure. If you were to click through, there's 6 questions here, you would see that 13, 14, 15, and 17 are all local questions. Every one of them starts with if this, and then follows. If you see 4 of your 6 questions, really 4 or 5 questions plus the list to start, if you get that many local questions, there's a reason they have to do that. They have to give you a prompt because you don't have a starting point from the setup itself. As a huge clue that an empty setup is probably as good as it's going to get. Move on. Use the questions to really be a barometer of sorts as to what you can expect.
Yeah, and I'll point out that 4 of the 6 are local. One of them is a list question, so it doesn't even count. That means there's one global question. And let me tell you, having the work from the other questions helps to answer that global question because it's not an easy one whatsoever. That's number 16.
Yeah.
And if you were to look at the solution to this game as I charted it out on scratch paper, you see the setup completely empty. You see the rules next to it, and then you see a whole bunch of solutions underneath it. As I just went from question to question and just made solution after solution, and then used that to help solve 16 when it was all said and done. Because I was like, I don't really know. I looked at 16, I was like, which of the following must be true? There's some global truth to this. I really haven't, discerned it. And it's a weird, answer in that particular problem. So I'm not sure I would ever have discerned that beforehand, which is just support for the statement that there are some things you're not going to get out of a game, or there's some things that they can ask that are so weird that you would never think to even look for that.
Yeah,
Tough
16
game, I
felt
think.
like a little bit of a break, a little bit of a gift, because the right answer is the first answer. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, yeah, okay. They didn't really make you work through the answer choices in 16, but it's still not the question I'd want to see as early. I saved it for last.
Making.
And I'm not ashamed to admit, I actually have 4 little mini diagrams here for this game. I suspect you do too.
Yeah, I have a bunch of little diagrams where I was just working stuff through for each question. Like, oh, let's do this for 13. Let's do this for 14. Let's do this for 15 and so on. I was like, that's just the way to do it. And let's be honest, 13 is like a really tough question to kind of run into. You have to stop and think a little bit. Feel free to skip it if you're like, I'm not getting anywhere with it. Come back to it. It's all right if something doesn't make sense for you to move on. This is section management. You don't have to do everything in the order that they give it to you. And sometimes it's actually bad for your health to do it in the order that they give it to you.
You'd be crazy to think the test makers are going to arrange this to your benefit every time. I mean, anyone who thinks that hasn't been paying attention.
100%. I think this is easily the hardest game on this test. This is a worthy difficulty level game. If somebody says, I struggled with that, my answer to them is, I understand why. This is not easy at all. This is tough. It is way harder than the first and second games. And it's designed that way.
Yeah.
And it's pretty well made. I mean, it looks really normal, and then
yeah, it lures you right in, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're just like, I'm going to take a nap after this. So a lot of people really used a lot of time. And one of the things I would say is if you're halfway into this and you feel like you're lost at sea, move on.
Yeah, go to the next. I was about to ask you that question, like float a hypothetical. Where would someone be maybe well advised to pull the plug on this, at least temporarily, go do game 4, and then circle back to 3 to see what they have left?
Everybody can do the setup and everybody can get the first question right. All right, you get to the second question on there, which is 13, as I recall. Mm-hmm. That question, I can see why this would stop people. So I would jump over that to another question and then see how that goes. If you're like, I'm still, dead on this, then I might start thinking about maybe this game just isn't mine and I should come back to it. Maybe I'll see something when I return. Then I would jump to game 4, which is what we're going to do now. And at that point, you could hopefully do game 4 in a reasonable amount of time. It's, I think, a good game, and then return back to this third game and finish everything. Again, section management, that is completely fine. It doesn't matter what order you do the questions in, you just want to do all of them if possible.
I'm with you. All right, let's look at game 4.
Excellent.
You want me to take the scenario, or you want it?
You take it.
Well, thanks. We called this one hotel shifts. And essentially what you have here is you've got 5 desk clerks at a hotel assigned to one of 3 hotel shifts. So there's right away like a time aspect to this. The 3 shifts are morning, afternoon, and night. So again, what do we have? 5 into 3. But here, unlike the first game, there's a little bit more of a linear aspect to it. The first game was just 3 groups, FGH. Here, it's 3 groups, but because they're chronological, morning, afternoon, and night, there's also sequence. Same grouping distribution, 5 into 3, and I think that's where we should probably start the discussion. But do note that the base here, morning, afternoon, and night, has a linear aspect to it as well.
All right, so let's start with the 5 into 3. Because I think we are familiar with such distributions from, I don't know, about 30 minutes ago.
Ourselves.
Yeah. We've got 5 into 3, and so once again, we've got 2 basic possibilities. We've got a 3-1-1 in some order or a 2-2-1 in some order. Now, in that first game, they eliminated the 3-1-1, so it went away there. That doesn't happen in this particular game.
That's right.
Those 2 scenarios end up living, and they have all the classic number rules. At least 1 clerk must be assigned to each shift. So you've got like the 1-1-1 as the minimum requirements. And we can now take a look at that game. And my first thought was I may just create 2 scenarios that have this. But I'm, of course, going to go through the rules before I jump into that, because I want to see whether or not that's going to be useful and how useful it would actually be.
Yeah, 2 distributions like this have a lot of potential to create templates. But it's also very contextual. You need to know the situation that you're dealing with, how the rules work, how the control of the variables gets created. And also to see if, like the first game, maybe one of these distributions goes away. There's nothing wrong with hoping for that.
Well, someone might say, well, why not just write out the 3-1-1? I'd be like, well, at this juncture before the rules, where's the 3?
You don't know where anything goes.
Is it morning, afternoon, or night? I don't know that yet. And so I wouldn't be inclined to start making 3 different versions of it. That would be work that might, as you point out, turn out to go away. So I don't want to waste time on that. Yeah. Instead, what I want to do is I want to think about using templates as I get towards the end of the rules, if not the end of the rules.
Yeah. So let's get into it. And the first rule actually begins to fix both of the distribution possibilities by assigning more clerks to the morning shift than to the night shift. So I imagine, Dave, you did this horizontally, like M-A-N, morning, afternoon, night, and then we're drawing stacks above for the people. Cool. Yeah, me too. What this tells you then, with the 3-1-1 and the 2-2-1, is that morning has to be either a 3 or a 2. And as we'll see in a second, night has to be a 1.
Yeah. So let's just isolate the 2 distributions. In the 3-1-1, if morning is going to have more than night, that means morning's 3, night is 1, afternoon is 1. That's the only lineup. All right. So at that moment, that's when I was like, oh, 3-1-1. And drew that out just because I like to visualize things. And again, you and I are different this way. You're doing it in your mind. I like to see it in front of me on the paper. Then with the 2-2-1, again, for the morning to have more than the night, morning's got to be 2, night's got to be 1. That means afternoon is 2. So I just drew a split and drew another diagram that was 2-2-1 in that order with morning, afternoon, night.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's a 3-1-1 that's fixed and it's a 2-2-1 that's fixed. And at this point, I hadn't really done anything else. I just drew those just so I could see them. And I know that you're like, that's a waste, or that's not the way I want to do it.
It's not how
Again,
I did it, but it's funny, the way I do games and the way I end up teaching people, especially early on in games, are not necessarily the same thing. I'll give the advice of how I did it, but I tend to recommend, especially as people are learning this stuff, that they write more. They take a chance, show the contrapositive when in doubt, write the distributions down, explore templates. Even if you find out they were a dead end, or worse, it was like this 10-path journey. There's no harm in learning this stuff by doing too much. Where I think a lot of people's self-limit is they commit themselves to one course of action, and that's all they ever explore. That's a mistake.
Yeah, preparation is learning. You're learning what works for you. You're learning what you need to do, what's helpful, what's not helpful. I may do something and you're like, that's not helpful. I may do something else and you're like, that is helpful. Choose what works for you. A lot of the case, it's consistency. You can see, as we've said many times before in talking about games, there's some elements of style. We each have stylistic differences in how we do this. It doesn't matter as long as we're getting the questions right. It's your personal style that matters. You are free to make that choice. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Yeah, my general reluctance over templates isn't because I haven't done them. It's because I have. I learned that I don't need them, or that I just feel like they're overindulgent or something.
And my general love of templates is because I have done them.
Same exact thing, just we came to different conclusions. But again, it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. You have to explore this stuff, even if it just means you're exploring it to rule it out.
All right, so let's go to the second rule, which is not numerical in nature and starts talking specifically about variables.
Yeah.
So here they're saying that P cannot be assigned to a later shift than S.
Stavros.
So P's not going to be later. And you can kind of see how that is an interesting wording.
Mm-hmm.
Cannot be assigned to a later shift. Why didn't they just say that P's got to be earlier? Because it doesn't quite mean that. P can, in fact, be earlier than S, but P and S can also be on the same shift. And that's where you have to look very carefully at the language. I always think whenever I read rules like this, that's an odd way to say that. And whenever I think that, it's usually because they've included some extra possibility. If they meant that it was P earlier than S, they would have said that. This allows for them to both be on the same shift, so be aware of what that means.
Yeah, slow down a little bit if you encounter something weird on this test. It's not arbitrary. Everything here is done very deliberately. It reminds me of the wording in the very first question of the course, that phrase, cannot be thought unlikely. If you just gloss right past that, you've really missed the point. You've got to focus on strangeness, not just because it has the greatest potential to screw you up, but the test makers are doing it with the intention of you committing an error. Slow down, get it right. So what this rule did for me is it created one not law. P can't be later than S, which means P can't be in that single night spot. So under the N group, I had a /P, but they could both go in the first morning shift together. So you don't get not laws here for S.
And that is interesting, and that's because it's earlier or the same time as. So that kills P from being in the very latest shift because only one person can be there. But it does not kill S from being in the morning shift because S and P could both be there.
As long as P's with it, yeah.
It feels asymmetrical, but that's because the rule is asymmetrical in this sense.
That's a good way to put it.
I try.
Success. One rule left. So at least we're fortunate to just have 3 to deal with. So the final rule deals with H. And H is grouping specifically. H is always with P or always with T, but never with both. So I had to write this in a few different iterations. I had one block with H and then a PT/ above it. And I had another block with HPT all in it and a slash through the whole thing.
See, I just put that H with the PT/ in a block and just put only.
Oh, yeah, yours is better. I'll give you that.
I don't know. It's all a matter of style. Of course, that means that in the 3-1-1 scenario, H is now in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
So in my little, 2 diagrams, I threw that in there as well with P/T above it.
In my single diagram, I had a not law for H under the night shift, which we know is always a single. H has got one person or more
Yep.
with it.
That's exactly right. And in the 2-2-1, that's very helpful because, in fact, at that point, you know that in the 2-2-1, on the night shift, both P and H are out, and that means it's S, T, or I think W is the third one. And W's are random in this game.
Yeah.
So W's, just floating around, happy to be working. But it's STW in that night shift on that 2-2-1. Not a huge amount of information in these two templates, but enough to have made me happy that I did it. I felt like I was gaining information about where a few variables couldn't go and what the possibilities were for the others. And you still know you've got that H and then P/T block in that 2-2-1, and you can start to see what the limitations are. The other block's going to be it's going to be 2 out of the group of that STWP that's floating around.
It's very reminiscent. It feels almost like a bookend of sorts, full circle, where the first game was this way too. Focus on the composition of the 2s and the 1s. In this case, the 3s, the 2s, and the 1s. Is hugely helpful. Just that that last rule with HP, HT, 2 questions, 19 and 22, are more or less solved by just that idea.
Yeah, and this setup is still somewhat open. However, it feels different than the prior 2 games, certainly than the third game. I felt like I had enough information and the rules were restrictive enough with that PS kind of like semi-sequence and the H block and knowing exactly what the layout was of the 3-1-1 and the 2-2-1 in terms of morning, afternoon, and night, that I was like, I feel pretty comfortable with this. And then again, question 18, list question. So then my comfort rose even more as I was like, excellent, another question I get right.
Yeah.
Notice that there are a couple answers in there where they do the counting of the morning and the afternoon. Whenever you have distributions in numbers and you have a list question, there's always going to be 1, maybe 2 answer choices that are wrong because they get the numbers incorrect. So, and then of course there's another answer in there that, gets S and P in reverse order. It's exactly what you'd expect. Every rule plays a little bit of a feature there, but there's only 3, so they double up on one of the rules.
Yeah, but you do see a lot of the numbers come in. For instance, question 19, which I mentioned before, the HP-HT block, deals with the 2-2-1 distribution. It talks about 2 people who can't go in the afternoon together, which means the afternoon's a double. You're in the 2-2-1, and of course, if H is in the afternoon, it's got to be with P or T. In this case, it can't be with S. So you see these numbers really playing a role far beyond just their initial construction. Even in the questions and answer choices, they really dominate. That might be the most important lesson to take away. When numerical distributions multiple are in play, whether you do templates or, as I've got, a single thing, they're going to control the game. Focus everything through that lens first.
Exactly. And then if you're uncertain with an open setup, go do some local questions. See how you feel about it. 20 and 21 give you some work to actually make happen. You should feel pretty good about this. And I think even the questions that are a little bit more global or abstract are actually not that tough to figure out just on the templates and what's possible there. And what that would mean for a lot of people is either they were rushing to finish this and they were hopefully able to just finish it, or they'd if they had problems with game 3, really is what the cause is. If they were able to go do this 4th game and finish it and still have a little bit of time, then they could go back to game 3. Different routes to get to the top of the mountain here is the real key thing, though. This is a pretty nice game to end the test on if this was the last game that you did. 3rd game, tough. 1st and 2nd games, again, I think the 1st game is really not that difficult. It's a good learning game, but it's not that tough. 2nd game, harder.
Yeah.
And it's funny. It's a section that overall you could use some time up, especially on the 2nd and 3rd games. But if you study this test and realize how they constructed it and where you could make the optimal choices, you can see a pathway to getting this section done inside the 35 minutes and having done really well on it.
Yeah. I mean, it's so easy to forecast. I was going through this and I just was thinking like forecast tragedy, because game 3 is the make or break. You waste all your time on game 3 and you squander a golden opportunity that follows it in game 4, which is objectively easier. But you make a strategic, not even retreat, but just pivot. You go to game 4, you get those points, which are more accessible. Circle back and see what you can do with game 3 as time runs out. That'd be a far, far better section overall. I know a lot of people, unfortunately, didn't follow that path.
And I think you look at this test and you think to yourself, okay, this is a pretty reasonable section of games, even with that difficulty in parts of, certainly game 3 and then maybe a little bit of part of game 2. Notice it's also, as you pointed out earlier, a really representative collection of game types. You've got 2 different linears, basic and advanced. We've got grouping, some combinations, templates, distributions all over the place. If you can sit down and be dominant on this type of section, it really bodes well for them throwing whatever they want at you and you being able to handle it. This is a great section to say to yourself, I should be able to master this and learn how to fight through that difficulty of game 3, whether I attack it head on right when I hit it or whether I come back to it after game 4. Either way, I should be able to fight my way through this and have the time to do it.
Yeah. This is the real ultimate sampler platter when it comes to games. You get a little bit of everything. The greatest hits of this restaurant. But again, if you can get through this, especially if you can get through it and enjoy it and feel competent and comfortable, you're gonna like the whole menu on test day. And that's really what this was to me.
On that note, Jon, I'd say I have nothing further to add.
We did it.
We did it. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it in the world. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and if so, please leave us a comment and a rating. And if you have any questions, as Jon mentioned, we will be doing a mailbag at some point in the relatively near future. Please send those questions to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com, and we'd be happy to answer those for you. On behalf of Jon and myself, we hope you've enjoyed it. Have a great week.